Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer of Authors on Mission. Today, we're joined by a special guest, Mark McClish, who has spent 24 years as a U.S. Marshal and developed a groundbreaking analysis technique where you can find out ways if someone's lying or being deceptive. And he has many books out there. We have I Know You Are Lying and Don't Be Deceived. And through that, he's helped just countless professionals learn how to spot deception through careful analysis of language. So today we're going to explore how our words can reveal the truths that we never intended to share, and kind of how he was able to illustrate that in his books. So without further ado, Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm very excited to learn about this because, I've talked to a lot of authors on this podcast so far, but this is definitely something I have not yet gone into depth about, is, the concept of truthfulness, deception. Maybe people intend to be deceptive or don't intend to be. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation, especially in terms of like how we translate that into the written word also. So yeah. Yeah, I always like to begin with, a little bit about you, because I gave you a little bit of a rundown of who you were in that introduction, but I'm sure I missed out a whole bunch. So, how did you come to be in the industry of figuring out lies? What led you to start writing this book, and where has it gone from there?
Well, as you mentioned, I spent years with the U.S. Marshal Service, but I spent 9 years teaching at our training academy. And when I got there, they asked me, what do you want to teach? And now the Marshal Service provides court security, but the other thing we do is we go after federal fugitives, people who escaped from federal prison or didn't show up for court or violated their probation. And so I said, that's the area I'd like to focus on. So they gave me classes such as operational planning, fugitive investigations, but they said interviewing techniques would also fall into that category. Would you like to teach interviewing techniques? Now, back then, our students attended a 10-week criminal investigating training program taught by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, referred to as FLETC, and they taught them how to conduct an interview. So when it came to our side of the house, where we teach them the duties of being a Deputy United States Marshal, we decided now they've already had instruction on how to conduct an interview. They're going to conduct interviews in our practical exercises. So let's focus more on, all right, how can you tell if this person's being truthful or deceptive? And the two ways to do that, the most prominent way was body language. And most officers, including myself, throughout their career, has had several classes on that, reading somebody's body language to determine if they're being truthful or deceptive. But I knew an upcoming way of analyzing statements was using linguistic analysis, how a person phrases their statement. And the reason the techniques work is there are several ways you can phrase a statement. So there's a reason why the person phrases it one way versus another way. And so in preparation to train our students, they sent me to a class on linguistic analysis. As I got into it, I found it to be very, very fascinating. And so eventually I did some studies on, during the 9 years I taught the academy, to determine, do these techniques work? And what additional techniques can we learn to determine if a person is being truthful or deceptive?
Yeah, okay. So, definitely a huge pathway that you took with that. And a very unique one too. Again, I mentioned before, I haven't spoken to a lot of people who've been in that line of work where it's all about interrogation and figuring out, what somebody's saying that might be truthful or untruthful. And I feel like you probably have just like a ton of stories about somebody who was, maybe trying to hide something and doing a really bad job of it, or, that kind of thing. And I'm sure, do you talk about that a lot in your book? Or is it mainly...
I talk about a few cases I worked on. My first book, I Know You're Lying, half of it is dedicated to the statement analysis techniques, and half of it is about some high-profile cases. Who's being truthful, who's being deceptive in the O.J. Simpson murder trial, Dr. Martin Luther King assassination, the John Benet Ramsey murder, and 5 other high-profile cases. We do analyze cases in the book, but also discuss the techniques. So in discussing the techniques, I'll share some examples of
Yeah, I was
cases
gonna ask
I've
if you
worked
could give
on.
a little sneak peek about some of these things that maybe our listeners will be able to take home with them and kind of figure out their own friends and family are like. Do you have any quick tips about, maybe a strategy that somebody might want to, if they're trying to figure out if
Oh,
somebody
yeah.
now after this?
The biggest thing is listen to what people are telling you, because too often we interpret, we think we hear one thing, but if you just take the time and just listen, you don't really need a lot of techniques. You can just realize, well, they qualified their statement. If a person says, I intend to plead guilty, they didn't say they're going to plead guilty. They intend to, which means they might or they might not. And most of the time, if they make a statement like that, they going to plead not guilty, but they'll end up pleading guilty. So just listen to how a person phrases their statement. But another unusual thing that people sometimes have a hard time with is I teach people to believe what people tell you. And, we think people maybe are lying to us, but the truth is most of the time people do not lie. Most people don't want to lie. And so what they'll do is they'll qualify their statement. And they'll add extra words that aren't needed. So I was watching Pawn Stars, and a guy brought in an item to sell. Corey Harrison offered him some money for it and said, I really can't go any higher than that. Well, notice he didn't say, I can't go any higher than that. He said, I really can't. He added the word really to add emphasis that this is as high as I can go. But that word really tells me, no, you probably can't go higher.
Yeah.
Which he did. He went higher and they made a transaction. So if you take that approach, I'm going to believe what you're telling me, a lot more things come to light. You realize this person's added extra words that qualify their statement, or you realize exactly what they're saying. I intend to plead not guilty. They didn't say, I'm going to plead not guilty.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about because, me being a writer and an editor, I'm thinking about that, in a literary standpoint. I'm almost thinking like, okay, so when I get these clients who are giving me these huge run-on sentences and stuff, it makes me wonder now, maybe you don't actually know what you're talking about if you're adding all these extra words in too. I mean, not to say that somebody who, writes at length might do that, but I'm curious to say, like, I found myself doing the same thing actually sometimes, like going around about to explain something when it could probably be one sentence.
Sure.
So I guess coming with that.
Yeah, extra words always give us extra information. Now, sometimes it's not deceptive information, but extra words always give you extra information.
Yeah, I guess like the underlining message of it, right? I mean, like, for example, when he added the word, like, I really can't go higher than this, like by saying that, like, it's almost, can you really not go by just saying that word? I get that.
Years ago, Tanya Harding said, with that Nancy Kerrigan incident, I don't know for sure what's going on. Well, the words for sure tell you she knows something, just doesn't know all the details. She couldn't say, I don't know what's going on, because that would be a lie. And again, people generally don't want to lie.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one too, by saying for sure, like just by definition, like, there's a little bit of something there maybe you don't currently understand, but there's something else there that you could be sharing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I tell people, just listen to what people are telling you.
I think there's probably a certain amount of that requires a lot of quick thinking too, because a lot of times when I'm talking to somebody, I might not even register that extra word that they said. But I guess for you, that was something you had to practice and kind of like train your ear to do. Is that correct?
Yeah, I tell people what to listen for. And so as they hear a statement, more things pop out. But yeah, it's a lot harder during an oral interview. If you have a written statement, those are fantastic. You can just take your time analyzing them. You can mark it up.
And start circling every word that doesn't make sense there.
Absolutely, yeah.
I actually flipped through, I know you were lying a little bit. And, in like first couple of pages, you mentioned that like, using words like certain choices of words too, not exactly extra words. Like, for example, you mentioned the instead of a as like kind of an indicator. Can you explain that a little bit? Like, what would be the difference between saying the or a?
Well, the rules of grammar tell us how we're to use, we have three articles, the, a, and how we're to use them. And you use the article the if you recognize what you're talking about, if you know what you're talking about. I drove down the street. So by saying the street means they recognize that street. But if we don't know what we're talking about, if we're not familiar with it, it's the first time we introduce it into a statement, we use the article a or and. For example, I was walking down the street when a man put a gun in my back. A man put a gun in my back. They don't say the man, they say a man, because they've never seen this man before.
Okay.
And they call it a gun, never seen this gun before. But now the rules of grammar also tell us
that once you introduce something into your statement using an article, a or and, you then have to transition and start using the article the, because now this man is no longer a stranger to you in terms of being introduced into the statement. His gun is the same way. So again, as I was walking down the street, a man put a gun in my back. So they use the article a. I could feel the gun press into my back. So now once they call it a gun, they correctly transition and say, I could feel the gun press into my back. So they know what gun they're talking about now.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. A lot of people might not even kind of register that sort of quick, rephrasing of it. But I can see how, by saying like the gun from the beginning, it kind of implies like maybe you know a little bit more about who was holding that gun or something like that.
In that example I gave you there, they went on to say, he then forced me into the car. Well, by calling it the car means he recognized that car. He acted like he never saw this car before. He was kidnapped.
Or like he was aware there was a car nearby.
He said a car, right. But now we make that transition from the indefinite article a or and to the definite article the kind of automatically because we grew up speaking English. We don't even realize we're doing it. But deceptive people will sometimes use the wrong articles because they're making up the story. They can't relate to it.
Now, almost as a devil's advocate now, like has it ever happened to you where you make that sort of assumption or that analysis and the person was just speaking correct grammar, like they just didn't realize what they were doing? I'm just kind of curious because
and that's what I do teach people. We have to take in consideration a person's grammar skills. If they have poor grammar skills, that may explain why they use the wrong article or perhaps the wrong pronoun. If English isn't their first language, that may play a factor as well.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. So you have to be familiar with, the sort of mannerisms and phrases that somebody might say if they speak English well or not well. It depends. Yeah.
Right. We still pick up on it, but that may explain it. But so, we're looking for several indications of deception, not just one thing.
Got it. Yeah. So, Mark, what's interesting is you've spent many years analyzing word choices when you're interviewing somebody or, interrogating them, whatever it may be. I wonder how that translated for you when you went about the process of writing your book, because you kind of would therefore go from listening to somebody else's word choice from having to pick out your own words and putting them on the paper. So was that kind of hard to do, to pick out your own words and your own phrasing, knowing how carefully you analyzed other people's words?
It was a little bit, because I think when you're writing a book, you want to make it more readable, presentable. And so sometimes I would rewrite how I would phrase that statement leading up to the statement we're going to analyze. Having a professional go through your book and kind of rephrase it definitely, helps. But with writing a book, my biggest challenge was when I'm giving a presentation, I can be very brief with it. In other words, I can say, in June of this year, President Biden gave a statement in the Rose Garden. And then we look at that particular statement that indicates maybe deception or exactly what he's saying. But when you're writing a book, I think you need to set it up more. You need to explain it more. The date, what was the occasion, what was he talking about, so that the reader engages in what you're talking about. Almost like in some cases they feel like they were there and they can relate to it more. And then we talk about whatever statement we want to analyze.
Right, got it. I like that you do that so that, the reader's interested and, engaged in what you're going to say. I mean, I think by nature, the topic of your book would engage many people too, because we can all relate to that. Like, is this person in my own life lying to me? Or am I coming across as deceptive to somebody else without even realizing it? So, again, by nature, the topic you've chosen is something that is almost like a need that had to be filled, I would say, for a lot of people who might be wanting to use this information. I'm curious, in terms of like the feedback that you've received from these books, have you heard from a lot of people who maybe picked up on your skills and then were able to implement it in their own experiences like that?
Yes, mainly law enforcement. I mean, that's my background. And most of the time, today I travel around teaching classes on statement analysis. And most of my classes are open to anybody, but the audience is, 90% usually law enforcement. And then plus law enforcement will send me statements to analyze. If they think he's guilty, they just go with it. But if they're not sure, then sometimes they'll contact me. So I've had investigators tell me that, yes, these techniques are great. I've used them, got this guy to confess by pointing out, certain things in his language. And that's always nice to hear.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's one reason a lot of people decide to write a book, right? I mean, one is to fill the need, like I mentioned before, but another one is because they want to make an impact on whoever's reading it. And it's always nice to hear when I talk to authors that they're getting that kind of feedback and knowing that, what they put out there is helping other people and they're learning from it. I mean, you're also teaching courses about that as well. So I'm sure by having a book and not only supplements your courses, but kind of adds a little bit of credibility to it too. Which came first, the courses or the book? The courses, right?
The classes came first.
Classes.
I was teaching at the academy for 9 years. And then even after I left the academy, came back out into the field as a supervisory deputy, I still would get asked to go speak at law enforcement conferences, which I could do on behalf of the Marshal Service. I couldn't earn any income, but as long as they paid my expenses, I could go speak. And so the teaching came first, and then by that time I had 10 years of experience and doing studies on deceptive language that I decided, okay, I'm going to put it out there in a book format because I can't obviously teach a lot. I'm still working for the Marshal Service. I had 4 offices I had to supervise. But if I write a book, that's available to a lot more people, and besides law enforcement. And again, at the time, the only books really out there, a lot of books on interviewing, but detecting deception was mainly body language. I don't think there was any books, in the year late 90s, 2000 that were on linguistic analysis. And so I wrote in 2001, I Know You're Lying.
Right. Yeah. And what's interesting is that, you mentioned it yourself, there weren't a lot of books about detecting language, but I think it's almost more important than the body language because anybody can, if they really want to make themselves stand still, in theory, right? But you actually have to speak in these type of interviews. So it's harder to control is what I guess I would say. And I think that's what makes your book more valuable too. So.
Yeah, it is. I mean, body language is a little subjective. I mean, a person scratches their nose doesn't necessarily mean they're being deceptive. Maybe they had an itch or something. So we have to factor that in as well. But with linguistic analysis, as I mentioned earlier, there's several ways you can phrase a statement. And the key thing is that people always phrase their statement based on all their knowledge. So if they've got additional information they're hiding, that will leak out into their statement and will cause them to phrase a certain way. Now, we know some people are better liars than others, but every once in a while, somebody might say he's a good liar. And I say, no, there's no such thing as a good liar. They're just bad listeners. If you listen closely, may not be a lot of deceptive indicators, but they will be there if that person's being deceptive.
Yeah. And I mean, when I was skimming through your book, you have a lot of studies that, prove your point for this. You mentioned the Mark Hackling case. You mentioned another case about, who was it? Another example here that I have written down, Detective Uzinski's. There's a different word choice that these people use in these different cases. It just goes to show just more proof behind it. So I guess my point in saying this is when you wrote your book, clearly you had to have a lot of background information to really just drive your point home. So all of your listeners, or all of your readers, found it credible and knew what you're talking about was actually valid. So I think that's great. And I'm wondering, did that take a lot of time to find these cases, or was it something you also just came across in the course of your career leading up to the writing?
Well, yeah, when I'm watching TV, I always have my DVR recording, whether it's 60 Minutes or Investigation Discovery or something like that, because they'll interview people. Maybe it's not a well-known case, but still it can serve as a good example if I see deception. Now, a lot of the cases I talk about, even in my classes, are more high-profile cases because, again, people can relate to them. I've heard about that. The Chris Watts from Frederick, Colorado, who murdered his wife and 2 little girls, gave a very informal interview, consists of him standing in his driveway or on his front porch. But at one point he said, I have no idea where they are. Well, as soon as I heard that, that's an indication of deception, because very rarely can a person honestly say, I have no idea, or I have no clue. Most people have an idea or an opinion on just about everything. I have an idea we can send astronauts to Mars. It's not going to work, so I'm not a rocket scientist, but I have an idea. And so when you hear that phrase, it usually means the person's withholding some information. Now, you may be talking to a friend, and they'll say, I have no idea. They're not necessarily being deceptive, but they probably do have an idea. It's just their way of saying, I don't want to talk about this. Let's move on to something else. But when you're interviewing a suspect, who you suspect committed a crime and they say, I have no idea, that's a bigger red flag.
So I guess your argument would be that it's best to, make a logical guess or explain why you don't have that idea, kind of like, oh, maybe they went to the library, but that doesn't make sense. I mean, wouldn't that also kind of mislead and sound deceptive too if you're kind of speculating, but you don't have the answer? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the best answer is I don't know where they're at. That's the best answer.
Right. Just like
it might be a lie. It may be a lie, but that doesn't show any signs of deception when you say, I don't know where they're at. I don't know what happened. I don't know who did it. But when you start to say, see, because they know what happened, it's hard for them to say that. That's a direct lie. So they add the phrase, I have no idea. And to them, that's okay to say it that way. But for us as a listener, that raises a red flag.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Speaking of all this deception, I guess I'm curious. It would be kind of interesting to kind of think about you as the one trying to deceive somebody else. Have you ever tried to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and kind of like, trick someone else and see if they pick up on these sort of, red flags, you could say, for your own? I
haven't tried to trick anybody, but I have thought about, just like you said, how would I say it if I was going to be deceptive?
Yeah. I mean,
and my techniques, my books, my classes, it's not one of my objectives, but it does teach you how to be a better liar. But even myself, when I think about, okay, I'm going to lie about this, how would I say it? Every once in a while, something will leak out because, again, we have the tendency to phrase our statement based on all of our knowledge.
Right. The reason I asked that was I was kind of picturing, you walking into one of your courses and starting it off by just like saying something completely that's not true and trying to see if the participants would pick up on it based on what they should have already known from your course. I just thought that was kind of interesting to think about. Like, for example, even writing your book, that would have been an interesting chapter to see if like your readers, realize whether or not you're being deceptive. Just kind of like a test, pop quiz.
Yeah, that's not something I did in the books. Now, in my classroom training, I give them statements to look at, and they have to decide if it's truthful or deceptive. We'll go through that to give them a little practical exercise. But
I like that. I like that you have those exercises. Is that also in your book, those sort of examples and exercises? I think I saw some.
No, I don't have any in the book. I mean, you could, and what I tell people, like I have a website which has famous cases I've analyzed. Maybe read the case first, what the person said, and then try to analyze it before you read my analysis. It's a way of practicing.
Yeah, to see if you're on the same page, if you're applying the concepts correctly. It's always good to have sort of a method for your readers to follow through after they've read your book, like some way to practice what you're saying or to put it into implementation or, give them another reason to continue reading and find out more. So that kind of thing is great for them to have, practicing their
skills. I have some on-demand training, which covers a lot more. Same thing in the books, but additional techniques as well. But in the on-demand training, it's set up that way. Here's a statement. Take your time, look at it. Then when you click the link to go to the next page, it gives you an analysis of it. You compare your analysis with mine.
Right. Yeah, okay, I like that. That's awesome that you have that in your books. Kind of going more into the writing process. We talked about, your word choice was a big, thing we talked about. We mentioned the research, the case studies as well. What other elements went into writing your book? For example, did you write it all on your own? Did you have a team that helped you do it? How did that look like? And then like the nitty-gritty of it. What was your
I wrote it all on my own. Now I did have somebody edit the book, which I'd highly recommend because we all make mistakes. And even though I gave the transcript to friends, hey, look at it, see if you see any errors. They're not professional editors, so they're going to miss stuff as well. So I'd always recommend having somebody edit the book for you. But no, I wrote it myself. The techniques, obviously, I've been teaching them for years. It was very easy to put to pen and paper. But the challenge for me was, okay, I need to add additional information, background information that leads up to what we're going to look at.
So can you explain that a little bit more to me? What the background information leading up to what we're going to look at?
Just the techniques themselves are pretty simple because it's the English language. There's nothing really technical about them. It's just I point out, okay, this word everybody knows. For example, the pronoun we indicates a plurality. More than one person was involved.
More than one person, yeah.
But what people don't realize is that the pronoun we also indicates a partnership. That at least two people shared the same values and agreed to do something together. You can't use the pronoun we without showing a partnership. We went to the baseball game, we went shopping. They did it together. And so why is that important? Well, most of the time we use the pronoun we see the partnership. It should be there. But there's some situations, such as a sexual assault, we not expect the victim to use the pronoun we. We went into the house and he raped me. A victim's not going to say that. They're going to say he took me into the house. He forced me into the house.
Yeah, okay.
But the we indicates either it's consensual or you're making up the story. And so that's what I do is I point out things in English language that, yeah, we're familiar with that word, but that word has perhaps more than one meaning. And so that's what I do is I point out what they're saying. But to get to that, especially if we're talking about a statement that somebody made, I just don't want to say what I just said there. If a rape victim used the pronoun we, I like to use actual case examples of that happening. And so I need to set the background, the tone. On this certain date, this person called 911, said this happened. Here's their statement, or maybe it's even analyzing a 911 call or something like that. And then talk about, what they said.
Right. I mean, well, 2 points from that is, a whole nother side of it is that 911 call. It's supposed to be kind of, you're in a panic. It's in the moment. So you're right. Whatever they're saying in that initial call definitely would have indication of whether it's actually like factual, if they're making something up about it, because especially if you're in the moment, it should be the most truthful thing that you say, right? So
right. Yeah, there are additional things besides analyzing the language, statement analysis, that we can use with the 911 call, with their plea for help and stuff like that, we're also looking at.
Right. Yeah, of course. And, the other point I was going to make about what you just said was kind of going back to what I mentioned before regarding like case studies and research. And I guess it's just really great that you found a way to lead up to your points, like you said, because any author can go out there and just say, this is the facts or this is the strategy, right? But, you need that credibility behind it. You need to back it up with, facts and examples. And that's something you did amazing. That's something that, makes sure that your book is going to be read and believed and passed along too. So it's a great method.
Because I can put together a presentation very quickly. Like every once in a while, I'll be asked to speak to business professionals. And so they want examples, that have to do with the business world. The techniques are the same, but I'm just finding new examples and stuff like that. I can put that together pretty quickly. But if you're going to write a book, it's more time consuming because, there's a lot more work that goes into it than simply, here's a technique, here's how it works.
Right, of course. Yeah, and it's, you need many different elements when you translate it from, the course to the book. And it's funny, before we started this podcast, you had mentioned to me you'd much rather give the lecture than write. So let's dive into that a little bit, being that our whole listenership right now are people who want to write a book and for the most part enjoy writing and everything. What was that like for you to kind of force yourself, quote unquote, to write when you'd much rather be talking? Like, what did you have to kind of go through in order to make that happen?
I had to force myself, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not a novelist. I don't consider myself to be a great author. I do consider myself to be a great lecturer. I mean, people love the training when they attend it. And so I can present it, having 9 years of teaching experience, I'm kind of polished there and presenting the material. But yeah, writing a book, like I said, that's a lot different. And I don't think I'll be writing a third book, but we'll see.
Well, see, that's the thing I was going to say is, you mentioned the importance of an editor before. The great thing is that, and this kind of goes to our listeners and to you as well. If you have an idea for a book and you know that it's something that's going to fill that need and that, it's going to resonate with readers, then why not just go ahead and write it? Even if you don't want to write it, there's so many different ways you can get it out there. I mean, you like lecturing. All you have to do these days is record yourself talking to a phone and it'll transcribe it for you. And then there you go. There's your book.
It is a lot easier these days. As you mentioned, you can have it transcribed like that.
Yeah. And then, an editor cleans it up. There you go.
Yeah. Even Word today will tell you to rephrase it, it'll underline it, maybe say it this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Trust me. I mean, the funny thing is, you mentioned I had to force myself through writing. I get that, like sometimes you don't have the creative energy after a long day of work, or maybe you have a little bit of writer's block, but that's a good thing too. There's many different ways to go about solving that problem. Like I mentioned, voice record yourself or jot down some notes here and there whenever you have a chance. And as long as you have something on the paper, the next step is kind of just putting it together, cleaning it up, and getting it out there. So.
Yeah. You go through it again, maybe you write a chapter and you reread it, weeks later, and things will come to light where, well, I could do a better job. I could rephrase it this way. It helps emphasize the point. And so, it's part of the editing process on your own. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And hey, even if you do have to wait till like weeks later, like you said, that in itself can be a benefit, because sometimes by taking a step away from a project and going back into it, you have more of that fresh perspective. I wouldn't ever, recommend waiting weeks before jumping back in, maybe like a day or two, but it all depends on, your schedule and your methods. Just out of curiosity, if you were going to write a book, do you have any ideas for what that might be, like a third book? I know you already have 2 books on deception, perhaps any other avenues you've considered in the past?
I do have one in the works, but like I said, it's just dragging on. But I would like to write a book on common sense. Use your common sense, and what it is would be like answers to some puzzling questions. UFOs, Bigfoot, gun rights. From a common sense point of view, do UFOs exist? Well, they exist, but are they aliens from another planet? No.
Probably just something that wasn't.
They're not going to fly around for 10 seconds, travel light years, fly around for 10 seconds, and then leave. If you apply your common sense, there's answers to a lot of these questions that are some are controversial, some are not. And so I'm making a list of different things I would talk about, because I don't think just, for example, UFOs, it would not be a lengthy chapter, but I just point out a few things that, again, some background information, the first time we ever had a UFO in the United States and stuff like that. But just point out from a common sense point of view, what does this common sense tell us about these different areas that, I would talk about.
Yeah, it's funny, Mark. I kind of think I see how that relates to the deception part of what you do, because in a way, you don't mean to be deceptive sometimes. You just don't have the common sense to say what you're saying clearly or to not be deceptive. So when somebody's saying, I saw this UFO outside, and okay, you might be lying, right? Or maybe you just have that common sense to be like, no, that was just an airplane. Yeah. So I see where your process went to come up with that idea. I like that a lot. I guess out of curiosity, do you have another example of another thing that might be in your book that you said you have some ideas written down? I'm just kind of interested now. What other common sense?
I'm trying to think now. Well, like I said, gun rights. What guns can we carry in the U.S.? We have a right to carry a gun, and the Constitution tells us that, but it doesn't say what type of gun. Okay. I'm in law enforcement, so I'm pro-gun, but I'm not. I don't think everybody should run around with a machine gun or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it's just different topics like that. Trying to think.
That you would touch it all upon just like common sense when in the interview receipts, right? Like common sense, like how you can respond in ways that aren't deceptive or something like that. Maybe
nothing to do with deception. Just it's just simply like trans athletes. That would be one of the latest things. And I guess the big discussion is, should a trans woman compete in women's sports? So let's apply some common sense. Part of it would be scientific as well, in terms of biological. That trans woman probably is a little bit stronger than most women, or maybe taller or something like that gives them advantage. But just pointing out certain things from a common sense point of view. Yeah,
and I can see how this should be almost like a tricky thing to write about, because you can write all about this and then get criticism from one end or the other, like, oh, how dare you say that? But the interesting thing is, if you do it correctly and you have maybe an editor or like a beta reader also who helps you kind of phrase it in ways that don't necessarily offend, but also just lay it out clearly and put that common sense first, it could be a really interesting read and kind of just like opens people's eyes to these concepts as well. I can see where you're going with that. I like that idea.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. Yeah, because like with the statement analysis techniques, every once in a while somebody may criticize my analysis, but and I'll reply to everybody, and it's not that many, but they're missing a point because this word absolutely means this. And most people will not use that word. Now, I'm not saying they did it. I'm just saying that's an indication of deception. But with the common sense book, yeah, there's going to be a lot of people that will disagree with it, even though common sense tells us this. Now they're still going to go with their own personal views, and so yeah, there could be more of a contentious thing, I guess.
Yeah, I understand that. It's interesting. I'm actually helping another client edit his book, and he was also in the military, so a lot of his chapters, have to do with, strong opinions about one event or another event. So one of my roles is kind of just rephrasing it and just more neutral language, or getting his point across, but also just like not bashing whoever it was that made that certain decision leading up to the event. You know what I mean? Kind of
Right.
just
Yeah.
let's say facts, let's say what happened, while also like lightly also getting your own opinion across too, but without making it too harsh. So it's interesting to think that you could write a book like that, and with the right team, you can also make it accessible to everybody. So something to think about.
I may do it one of these days.
Yeah, I mean, hey, continue putting those ideas out there, and then even if it's, months, years down the road, you'll have them there, and you can always, reach out to somebody, help me organize this, help me make this accessible to everybody. That's kind of the benefit of writing in the world these days. To all of our listeners out there today, if you have an idea like that, but you're not quite ready to share it, or you don't think it's the right time to get started, I'll always advocate for just getting started, start writing something, but at least get the ideas out there so you don't forget it. So yeah, continue taking notes and putting that out there. So Mark, my next question to you is, if our listeners today are super interested in everything we said and want to kind of implement what we've been talking about, I know they can pick up your books on Amazon and bookstores. How can they potentially join one of your courses or get in touch with you otherwise if they're interested in learning more? We've talked about your books, we've talked about your courses. I'm wondering if our listeners today want to find out more information about you and what you can do if they ever want to join one of your courses, how can they get in touch with you? Where can they go to find out more information?
Visit my website, statementanalysis.com. And on there, you can find out where I'll be speaking. Again, most of my classes are open to anyone who wants to learn how to detect deception. You'll also find a link for my books, which are available on Amazon.com, but also a link to my on-demand training. And that's what I would highly recommend. If I'm not speaking anywhere near you, you can take the on-demand training. It's equivalent to 2 days of classroom training. As I mentioned earlier, there's statements you can look at and analyze, compare your analysis with mine. But the final analysis, I have you conduct an analysis and send it to me using an online form, and I will read it over and provide you with feedback how well you're doing.
Oh, I love that. So it's not even just going through a system or a robot. You're directly responding to the messages. That's incredible. It's very hands-on.
Yes,
So
and then after you complete it, you can print a certificate of completion as well.
that's awesome. I mean, hey guys, if you're listening right now, you should definitely go there because, hey, it's a course where you're literally being able to talk to Mark, who's the expert in all of this, and you'll be able to have your own certificate. That's really cool. I like that. That's something that's unique about your course. A lot of them, I think, are just, you press the button and then boom, you're done. But that's awesome that you're interactive. That's great. So yeah, I mean, now that we're sort of wrapping up the podcast and we've talked all about all these different tips, do you have any last words of wisdom that you might want to share with our audience here today? Let's say,
reiterate something you said. I mean, if you have an idea, even though you may feel like myself, I'm not this great author, put it to pen and paper, and it may take you a while to work on it. But again, with the technology we have today, as you pointed out, it's a lot easier to write a book. And then again, somebody can help you with the editing or rephrasing it. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with putting it out there and make
Yeah.
available for the world to see. Because with Amazon, yeah, you can list your book on Amazon, so that makes it easy to sell it then.
Yeah, it's never been easier to get your book out there, right? Like if you have an idea, again, even if you don't think it's the right time right now, or if you're a little bit nervous about getting started, just put some ideas on paper, hold on to it till you're ready to share it. There's so many different ways that you can have a team of people at your side, right? The editors, the marketers, any beta readers. Here at Authors on Mission, we do, the whole package kind of tailored to whatever your needs might be. So always an extra, fun thing to think about too. So with all of that concluded, I think we learned a lot today about, analyzing words and, finding ways to figure out if somebody is deceptive or not deceptive, but also putting that into the text form, which is something that, a lot of us are probably doing right now if they're writing your own books at home. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a true pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Awesome. So, you know what? That brings us to the end of today's episode with Mark McClish. His insights show us just, how language choices can reveal deception. And, it's really revolutionized, I think, a lot of different industries. Anybody who's picked up his book now knows how they can spot that, in their everyday lives, spot that deception. So if you're interested in learning more about this, check out Mark's techniques on his website or in his books. And make sure you, stay tuned for another episode of Authors on Mission for next week, because, we always have new authors on here. They'll be talking about their own experiences, and you never know the kind of insights you'll be able to find out by listening in and seeing what their experiences were like. So with no further ado, Mark, thank you again. And to everybody else, keep leading, keep writing, and keep inspiring, and have an amazing day. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.